this next file of the Yuka story, I feel compelled to give a warning. There is loss, there is violence, and the archivist was very descriptive in his translation of this story. So, if that would cause you grief or difficulty in any way, I would urge you to move past this particular file and wait to see what happens next. When we last left Yuka, tragedy had befallen her party. Fierce warriors with their faces painted a stark white came out of the woods. There was loss, there was blood, and Yuka herself was wounded just before seeing something in the sky she didn't quite recognize. And now, we read what happens next. Yuka did not know how long she had been swimming in the black. Moments, a day, a season. All she knew was that she was deep. There was no gray ring of promised daylight above her. There was no warmth to the water she danced in. All she could feel was the eternal eyes of the Deep Mother on her. She could not see them, but Yuka knew the Deep Mother was there, swimming in all her titanic glory not far below her. Horrible pain would sometimes hit her in waves, then wane as if it had never been there. It was all Yuka could do to continue to swim. She needed to get somewhere, anywhere, that was out of the black. What was worse was the voices. There were voices that Yuka knew and voices that were strange. They swam about her like the Deep Mother's children, coming in close, then diving down far away from her. All that Yuka ever was or knew was in the black until the moment she opened her eyes. Life, bloody, cold, and painful, came crashing back into her senses with the deepest breath she had ever taken. When she opened her eyes, the world was bright and brown. Yuka could feel furs beneath her and a fire beside her. As her vision cleared, she realized that the brown above her was the roof of some tent made of roughly tanned jaca hide. The roof was circular and carved with wood, and branches knotting the pieces together. At the center of the roof, there had been a round hole that had been cut to let the smoke from the fire out. She began to rise, but almost passed out again from the pain. Yuka groaned. After a moment, she slowly turned her head to the side. To her left was a wood-burning fire crackling merry in a deeply dug pit. Yuka could smell duskwood burning and hear the crackling of the bitter sap of the mountain tree. In the forest there is no need of a kulak, she thought to herself groggily. It was not until she saw the great form of Agloo laying on the other side of the flames that the events of what had happened prior to her sleep came back to her. Faces pasted in sky white, red blood splashing across my eyes, Agloo fighting, Takani killing, Agloo hurt, Agloo stabbed, Agloo. Yuka pushed herself up from her furs, her vision blurred from the pain again as more shot across her chest and temple. It was near blinding. Agloo! The large form of her aunt was encased in a heavy swaddle of jaca skin and other furs. Yuka's voice did not wake the great warrior, but Yuka could see under the furs that her massive chest was slowly rising and falling. She could smell the scent of blood and vomit hanging over her aunt. No, by the green on the wind, no! Yuka! Yuka's name was rasped somewhere on the other side of the fire. Yuka spun and saw the light rider standing before her tent flap. The old woman's hair was unbound and lay in loose gray tangles over her shoulders. She was wiping her hands on a small rag that looked to be stained with blood. Let her sleep, girl. The old woman jerked her head towards the flap, beckoning Yuka out. Exhausted and despaired, Yuka knew of what little else to do but follow. When Yuka came from under the tent flap and into the daylight, she saw that their party had taken shelter in the gutted village where they had run into the war party. Annexed near the center of the town, where Yuka had seen the horrific sight of the burned villagers. The nomad woman was conducting one of her own warriors and two of the other Salt Sisters in carrying something wrapped in skins from the center of the village, over the hill where the boats were moored. "What are they doing?" Yuka asked. The Light Rider sighed. "We are giving them the only burial we can. Nanook is taking them to rest in the black. With any luck, the Deep Mother will take them to the shallows and bring them below." Yuka noticed with a painful lurch in her stomach that the women were hauling the fire-blackened bodies of the people whose home this had been. She saw Imik on the other side of camp. He was hobbling towards them, leaning on a crutch fashioned from wood. In his hands were a small bundle of bright green, star-shaped leaves. He dropped them into a boiling clay pot that was hung over a small cook fire nearby. "How long was I asleep?" 3 days, the Light Rider replied flatly. Who are those demons that attacked us?" "Do you think that I know?" The old woman walked away from Yuka to stand by Imik in the boiling pot. Yuka could smell the strong, sweet scent of starleaf coming off the steam. The Light Rider turned the pungent broth in the pot with a fallen twig. "Sky criers are a rare sight these days. Those who paint their faces the colors of the sky are cursed and accept hatred of the land around them. Whoever they were women who made a pact with death. They were nothing more than corrupted souls that reject both green and black." The next words the old woman spoke seemed to be more to herself than Yuka. Are you well?" Imik asked Yuka. His voice was uncertain, worried. "She was shot in the head with a spitfire. I doubt well would count among any of her feelings any time soon, boy." Imik lowered his head at the Light Rider's words. "The white-pasted fools should work on their aim. I am not yet lost." Yuka gave Imik a half-smile that he returned. "How can we hope to fight the Camden when we fight like that among our own?" The Light Rider seemed to say these words to the wind and the trees around rather than to the people standing near her. Having no answer, Yuka's eyes turned back towards a still smoldering, desecrated totem where the villagers had been put to burn. Every village that sang to the Green Spirit had great wooden totems like this at the center of their land. The totems of those who rode the black water or prayed to the Deep Mother below had smaller, handheld totems, typically made from bone, lurker bone, usually. The mighty duskwood tree that would make the center of a green village, like the one before Yuka, would always be chosen by the greeneress of the village. Yuka's heart sank as she looked on at the ruin of this unknown village's legacy. Every blackened image carved upon the great wood was meant to tell a tale of those that had burned below it, along with the tales of their ancestors. These sky criers took more than their lives, she thought to herself. They burned the heart of the village as well as their flesh. Now the Green Spirit will not find their souls to carry off. In that moment, Yuka saw the eyes of the young woman she had killed. Nausea returned to her momentarily. Are they all dead? Those who attacked? The old woman did not look up from her pot. "Fled. The greater part of their number ran to the trees at the sound of some horn blown from farther into the woods. I did not know which direction." The old woman looked up and squinted at the trees around them. "I know little of lands such as these. My lot is of ice and water, not trees and—" She paused as the cold breeze sifted through the forest around them. "Whispers." The Light Rider brought the branch out of the boiling water. Hanging at the end of it was a drenched, steaming strip of wool. "There is an abundance of this material in the village. Come, help me with your aunt. Boy, bring the pot." With a growing sense of unease, Yuka followed the Light Rider back into the tent from where she had come. Imik struggled in behind them with a steaming pot. The sickly sweet scent of sickness and vomit seemed heavier in the air from before, when Yuka had first woken up. The fire within had simmered down to the embers. Aside from a slow rise and fall of her chest, Yuka's aunt remained motionless. The old woman knelt next to the great warrior and motioned for Yuka to do the same. She walked to the other side of her prone aunt, feeling the tears already beginning to well at the corner of her eyes. To her surprise, as she glanced at the old woman, she saw that the paragon of salt and ice, her shoulders were slumped defeatedly, and tears had already begun to fall from her. "The sea bear of the west," the old voice rasped in the quiet of the tent. She reached forward and pulled back the furs. Yuka cursed herself for nearly gagging of what little was left in her stomach. The smell and sight of the inflamed wounds on the bare flesh of a woman she loved so dearly was almost too much for her. Agloo's leg, that had suffered a wicked spear thrust, was swollen to the size and shape of a small boulder. It was the color of a low sun, with bright blood crowning the gaping cut. Above it, low and more centered to her belly, were two large holes filled with blackened blood. They looked like the large eyes of some cruel spirit. Purple veins that looked like dead roots were spread around the wounds. "A spear hit to the knee is bad enough, but it is the higher wounds that will kill her." Yuka felt the world ripped from deep inside her heart. "What did you... She will heal, yes? In time?" "Child." "In time, she will heal. She must." "Girl." The tears fell freely from her as well. No, you don't understand. Agloo is the strongest woman of these hills. She... "Yuka!" The steel in the old woman's voice silenced the younger girl. The Light Rider was looking hard at her. There was no anger in her eyes. It was more pitying than anything. "Legend or no, God Rider or no, you will need to hold fast to cruel truth if you wish to live as one who leads. Look at your aunt, girl. No soul, strong or otherwise, should linger in this life in that much torment." The Light Rider held up the wool. "Brush back her hair and tilt back her head." Yuka could almost not bring herself to touch Agloo. Her fingers rose shakily to the woman's brow. As she moved the matted strands of thick brown hair out of the way, Yuka almost gasped at how cold the sweat-slick skin of her aunt felt at her touch. But she did as she was told. The Light Rider began muttering something to herself that sounded like a chant. She squeezed some of the water over Agloo's slightly parted lips. She then gently laid the wool over the great woman's brow. "Salt water and star leaf, taken through the skin, is a relief of sorts. It can take away some of the ache." The Light Rider laid a hand on top of Agloo's head, sighing sadly. "Ataksak, the men have returned." The harsh voice came from the tent's entrance. Yuka and the Light Rider turned. Nanak and her own blue-cloaked warriors stood at the tent flap. The old woman nodded and beckoned for Yuka to follow once more. She motioned for Imik to stay. "Keep dousing small amounts of the broth over her lips and mouth." Yuka rose, feeling once again a wave of nausea and a dull pounding begin in the side of her head. When they left the tent for the waning daylight, Yuka could see that all that was left of their party had gathered. Nanak had 3 remaining warriors, and the Light Rider had 3 Salt Sisters standing stoically next to them. The looming figure of Takani and his fierce, gnarled oarsmen stood grimly on the other side. There were 7 of these hard men left, including Takani. There was a long, strange silence that stretched between the group as Yuka came through the tent flap. Nanak spoke first. The fierce, short-haired nomad woman stepped forward. "The time has come to move onward." Takani turned and spat into the muddy snow next to him in an answer. Nanak went on angrily. "The villagers' burial are finished, and there's no telling when those sky criers will return. We must move now." Takani stood fast, rooted to the ground. He grumbled back. "She has not passed yet." "She could linger for days," the the nomad said exasperatedly. "We need to distance ourselves from this place at speed if we are to make it to Tungiok." The Light Rider spoke. "Nanak, I doubt she will last another night." "That is too long to wait," the nomad's warriors murmured in ascension. Takani spoke again. The sound of his voice was like a bending oak. "We will not, and had not, sunk oars for Nanak of the ice wastes. My men taste salt, duskwood, or blood at the order of only our war queen." Nanak looked like she was holding back a scathing reply. The tone of her reply was forcibly level. "And she lays dying." Two of Takani's oarsmen stepped forward angrily. Nanak's own warriors lowered their spear points. Takani held up a hand to keep his men back. The Light Rider stepped forward. "You are an oarsman, loyal to his chief," she nodded at Takani. "It does you and your men honor. But the great Agloo knew of the importance of this journey. We should give the great war chief a proper burial, but then make haste." Takani cut her off fiercely. "She is not of the Black Salt Witch, and neither are we." The Salt Sisters' voices rose in fury at her words. Nanak's warriors brought their spears fully level now, aimed at Takani. Nanak stepped forward angrily towards the Oarmaster. Her hand went behind her back. Yuka saw the whole scene blur slightly in front of her as the pounding in her head worsened. Next to her, she noticed the small diminutive form of the Light Rider step back, closer to where Yuka stood. The old woman was fumbling at something in one of her cloak pockets. When the old woman brought her hand up, Yuka could not make out what her hand held until the roaring crack blasted away the shouts of all around. Yuka stepped back, almost falling back through the tent flap. Snow and rock from the ground between Takani and Nanak sprayed upward. The sickly sweet scent that had come from the firing of the Skycryer's Spitfires filled Yuka's senses again. Queasiness ceased in her stomach and rose to her throat, and she almost gagged once more. The pounding in the side of her head worsened. All were quiet before the Light Rider. The old woman's eyes had an icy fury as she lowered the small Spitfire in her hand. She let the deadly tool drop onto the ground next to her. "We will not lose another of our number to this folly. Step back, all of you." As the tension eased, Yuka could feel her own nausea and stress wavering. Nanak lowered her head and took a step backward. Takani remained rooted to his spot, but motioned for his men to step back again. Yuka looked at all gathered. "This has begun all with hope," she thought to herself. "We began with certainty. Without Agloo, we're a rabble. We go to hunt the Skycryers." Takani's voice broke the falling silence. "It will attack again if we do not. It is what Agloo would have done and wanted." Nana cursed under her breath. "What do you know of a woman's mind, you fool?" "Nanak," the Light Rider spoke flatly. Nanak bit her tongue and turned away. The Light Rider turned to Takani. "I am not greenborn, and I do not carry your totem. The one who does lays in the tent behind me. I have not the strength to compel you. I can only ask you to listen, to reason. If we continue down our journey together, we will have a better chance of making it to Tungiok. If you believe that vengeance is what your war chief would have wanted, go. If you believe truly that she would rather you continue protecting those she meant to journey with, stay and leave with us in the morning." Takani looked hard at the woman of ice and black water before him. His eyes held suspicion, anger, but not hatred. The tall oak of a man turned to his other oarsmen. "To the red on the wind," he rasped, and all men around him raised their oar blades and clubs and knives, all held in their fists and cheered. The Light Rider lowered her head. Takani's men turned on their heels, picked up their packed supplies, and sprinted into the forest, behind their oarmaster. "You're just going to let them go?" Nanak hissed to the Light Rider. The woman nodded. Do you wish to fight them? My Salt Sisters can wield a skinning knife well enough, but your warriors are all that we have. Now, anyways. Yuka saw Nanook turn to her warriors. Go and see that the men stay well away from the collected Spitfires. All who had gathered in front of the tent were moving away, leaving Yuka alone with the Light Rider once more. Will we go on without them? Yuka asked. But before the old woman could answer, Imik's voice called from the tent. Yuka! Yuka, you must come! Hurry! Yuka hurled herself through the tent flap, her heart racing. Imik knelt, unevenly with his half-leg, near Agloo's head. The great woman's head was moving back and forth, slower and slower, and her lips were moving. Agloo! Joy surged through her, and she ran to kneel at her aunt's other side. The great woman continued to move back. Her head continued to move back and forth slowly, and move her mouth wordlessly. Agloo! Agloo, I'm here! Yuka rested her hand on her aunt's brow. Yuka saw Agloo's eyes flutter open briefly. Alive? Her aunt's words were barely above a whisper. Yes, Agloo, we are. Agloo's eyes strayed open finally. I heard Kani bellowing. What is amiss? He's leaving. Gone. Agloo's body rocked alarmingly as she gave a loud, wet cough. Left. Where? For where? Her words were slow and slurred. Though Agloo's eyes were open, it did not seem to Yuka that they really saw. Yuka turned to see the Light Rider standing in the front of the tent flap. Call for him, please. Tell him his war queen is awake. But the old woman shook her head at Yuka. His men are already well gone. Yuka cursed. She turned back to her aunt. He goes to hunt those who hurt you. Agloo gave another cough that almost sounded like a chuckle. My wonderful iron-hearted man. Well, Yuka, you'll have to go and get him back then. Yuka looked down at her aunt, almost giving out a laugh. Get him, should I? And how would a god rider such as I do that? Agloo gave a shuddering sigh, then rasped the word totem between coughs. Yuka smiled despite her sorrow. Will Takani let me carry your sea totem? Agloo turned her head towards Yuka. He may, if you brought it to him. Her aunt then sniffed once, her body trembling suddenly. By the great on the wind, I do not have long, do I? No. Yuka felt tears blur her eyes as the Light Rider gave the hard answer. Not long, no. Agloo, in pain, struggled to answer. Then, I shall ask a boon of you all here. Yuka felt the Light Rider kneel next to her, before Agloo. Name it, the old woman said. A green death. I want a green death. Yuka felt a stone, colder than death's breath, fall into her stomach. No, she thought to herself, and she heard the Light Rider curse softly. Agloo, the green heiress of this village was most certainly burned with all the others. It's not possible. Agloo shook her head at the woman's words. Her reply came in labored breaths. She is not the only green heiress here. After a long, strange moment, Yuka felt the eyes of Imik and the Light Rider fall on her. I cannot. Agloo, the Light Rider replied. This girl belongs to the Deep Mother below now. Agloo scoffed out a cough. She was green before she was ever black. The Light Rider was silent for a long while. Her next words were to Yuka. Do you know the ritual? Yuka was frozen. She felt dead inside, hollow. The numbness that raged within her was worse than any pain. She nodded. Do you have what is needed? Yuka did not want to think of the sung root seed resting in her pack. She nodded again. Your pack is by the tent flap. Yuka could have sworn that the next steps she took were taken by another. She moved to her pack resting against the wall of the tent, and retrieved the small pouch of the sacred seeds from the bottom of her pack. They were resting under her mother's axe. When she knelt again by Agloo, she took one of the small pods out. The seed of every sang root was red and black, like the stones that made up the ground around a fire mountain. Every one of them had the look of a person's heart, but it was charred and dead-looking. To all in Yoked who did not sing to the green spirit, this seed was feared. To all who did, the seed was feared and loved. I will not do this, Agloo. The small pod trembled in her hand. Her voice was softer with every word she spoke to her aunt. For a moment it seemed like the woman did not hear her, but after a moment her aunt spoke. My last wish, my love. You cannot... Her voice trailed off for a moment. I want to sing with your mother again. Yuka choked on a sob. She felt as though if she moved, she would shatter into a million pieces. Yuka. The Light Rider's voice was firm, but not unkind. Choose. The word was simple. Yuka looked at the ruin of what those white-faced demons had made of her aunt, and she remembered the sound of her mother's voice. I will. Yuka took a deep breath and looked to both Imik and the old woman. I need your help. Doubt crossed the Light Rider's face. These are green matters. Resolve quickened Yukin's mind. Will you find me someone of the green to help, or will you? Her own firmness of her voice surprised her. The old woman sighed and nodded. Yuka turned to Imik. She nodded to Agloo's lower half. Grabbed her legs. Imik looked anxiously at the two women, then shifted over to Agloo's legs. Yuka looked at the Light Rider take her arms from behind. It was the first time Yuka had ever seen the old woman look uncertain. She moved behind Agloo and slipped her arms under the great muscular arms of the warrior woman. After settling, the old woman nodded at Yuka. Yuka took another deep breath. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's words. Fighting through the ferocious dread in her heart, she opened her eyes. The two of you are the roots. You hold the soul in place. She looked at the Light Rider. Do you have a blade? The old woman nodded and produced a long, thin skinning blade from under her cloak. Yuka took it. She breathed deeply again, willing herself to remember watching her mother at work. When the sang takes root, the spirit takes notice. Yuka could feel the knife in her hand begin to quaver as her mother's quiet voice filled her ears once more. It is the beat of the world which draws it. You must be quick, you must be true. There is no better way to have the green know a soul. In every green temple of the cliffs and mountains, there grows a sang grove. There is no place more powerful, nor a ground more fearful to walk upon, than the soil above a sang grove. It is where the sang plants, the sang roots, grow deep and strong. Yuka asked the green spirit for her mother's guidance before she began. A small, cowardly part of her hoped that Agloo would be gone before she could start. Yuka carefully laid the point of the old woman's razor-thin blade just below her aunt's left breast. She sighed before speaking. This song is the red spirit's last. Let every word, every whisper, from now until all is gone, be given on the green. The spirit will find you. Hold fast to the wind. Yuka did not recall how long she paused after this. Strike true, child. Agloo's words almost knocked Yuka flat. Gripping the knife as hard as she could, Yuka put all of her weight into the thrust down. Agloo cried out only once. The long blade of Nanuks sunk far down into the soft flesh near the heart. Yuka had to bite her tongue to hold her own wail. The great woman's body rocked violently. Imik put all of his weight into the woman's legs. The Light Rider gritted her teeth and held fast to Yuka's massive arms. Yuka stayed her course. She almost lost her nerve as she felt the vibrations of her aunt's heartbeat through the blade and its handle. Yuka used what was left of her strength to yank the knife free. Deep red blood and rancid air left the new wound made by the knife as it left Agloo's body. Yuka could feel her breath starting to come in her lungs shorter and quicker. She could see black circles of dark light begin to form at the edges of her own sight. Damn you, remember why? Remember why? Yuka shoved all the riot of feeling she felt back down into her belly as she forced herself to complete the rite. Agloo had shuddered heavily once, then laid still. Her chest jerked once, then sank slowly. Yuka knew that her time was short. Steeling herself for the last of it, Yuka, with 2 fingers, holding to the precious sang seed between them, pushed the seed deep into the knife wound. As the seed found its place, Yuka felt the once strong heartbeat of her aunt, Agloo, slow, then go still. Yuka, Imik, and the Light Rider were left breathing hard and fast next to the now still Agloo. You did well, girl, the Light Rider said softly. Her eyes were fixed on the wound under Agloo's heart. She seemed dazed. I must go down by the water now. Her voice lost its volume as she rose. The old woman seemed to be whispering to herself once more. Yuka caught only a few words. Deep mother, forgiveness. Yuka was left in the silent tent with the one-legged Imik. Thank you, she said after a moment. She turned to see tears swimming down from Imik's eyes. He looked down at his fallen leader. A breeze kicked in from the tent flap when the Light Rider left. Yuka felt the cold air from the rising night outside chill the drying blood covering her hands. She looked down. Pain surged through her head and nausea threatened to overwhelm her once again as she thought of Agloo's blood on her hands. Yuka forced herself to hold it back. It hurt her to do, but she did it. Tears of her own came then, but she remained upright. What are we to do now, Yuka? The boy, Imik, looked at her, pleadingly. What can we do? But Yuka only had eyes for what lay next to her dead aunt. The arm-length bone totem rested on a small pool of Agloo's blood. Yuka reached for it. She grasped the strange length of petrified bone. I have just sent my aunt to the green after having swum the black. Through the sorrow and despair that clouded her heart, Yuka felt something oddly familiar. She felt a rush in her blood, a fire, almost a fury, rise within her. It was a strange ghost of a feeling, not dissimilar to the way she had felt when she had risen from the black, riding a deadly god. You'll need to find your own way with the others, Imik. They go for Tungiuk in the Green City, but I must turn to the red on the wind. Yuka stood, head still throbbing, hands still carrying a loved one's blood and a bone totem, and left the tent to go make her preparations. That is a sort of story that is very difficult to read. Yuka's tale does have tragedy, great tragedy, as we see here, but her story is one of much more than just sadness and violence. There's a hope in her story that will be coming down the trail. So take heart. Not every file will be quite as hard as this one. Just know there is more to come.